Hi, welcome to our lesson. In this lesson, we'll explore the independence movement in Latin America by answering the lesson question, how did Latin American nations gain independence? This is a painting by Antonio Fabres of a priest named Padre Miguel Hidalgo, who began the Mexican independence movement against Spain. We'll discuss Hidalgo in further detail later in the lesson. Let's get started. In this lesson, we will learn about independence movements in Latin America and then explain the causes and effects of revolution in Haiti. We'll move on then to describe how other Latin American countries gained their independence. And finally, we'll identify the challenges facing newly independent countries. Now let's review your words to know for this lesson. They include abolish, bias, and those are your academic words. You also have coup d'etat, criollo or criollo, mestizo, and peninsular or peninsular in Spanish. Keep an eye out for these words in your lesson. You'll see them again in the lesson summary, and we'll define them as we encounter them. In this lesson, we'll look at the independence movements in Latin America. First, we'll look closely at the movement in Haiti. Next, we'll travel to South America to discover how their countries were bound together in their struggle for independence. Finally, we'll look at the revolution in Mexico and how it differed from South America's fight for independence. Not one of these three is more important than the other, but all contribute to telling the story of how Latin America as a whole gained independence. Let's start by thinking about what independence means to a country. Enlightenment ideas had already spread to the Americas. With the news of the French and American revolutions, Latin American countries became inspired. At the time, Latin America was under European control, with most of it colonized by the Spanish, but France, Britain, and Portugal also had colonies in the region. Once Napoleon invaded Spain and put his brother on the throne, Spanish colonists were inspired to act. They had no desire to serve a French king. With all of this fire smoldering, revolutions in Latin America were absolutely inevitable. The first colony gained its independence in 1804. By 1820, there would be only a handful of European colonies left in the Western Hemisphere. In this lesson, we'll look at how events in Europe and the ideals of liberty and equality led to Latin American independence. Let's look back at our lesson question. How did Latin American nations gain independence? In the warm-up, we looked at the French Revolution and other events in Europe. These revolutions would spread to the Americas, and by 1820, virtually all European colonies would win their independence. Let's start by looking at the revolution in the French colony of Haiti. The first Latin American country you will learn about is Haiti. Saint-Domingue, now called Haiti, occupies one half of the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean Sea. The other half, here, is called Santo Domingo. Saint-Domingue was a colony of France, while Santo Domingo was a colony of Spain. Soon after the French Revolution, the enslaved people of Haiti rebelled. Slavery was legal in Saint-Domingue, and notice the spelling of Saint-Domingue. And hundreds of thousands of enslaved people worked on plantations, mostly sugar. Saint-Domingue's economy was dependent on sugar plantations. Plantation owners forced enslaved Africans to work under difficult conditions. Work on sugar plantations consisted of strenuous manual labor. and the enslaved population greatly outnumbered free peoples by 10 to 1. Let's take a look at this chart to see what I mean. It's called Spanish Colonial Society, and it captures a look of society back in 1789, when free whites occupied just a sliver of the population along with free non-whites. Who made up the majority of the population? The enslaved persons of 1789. Remember, 10 to 1 is what they outnumbered. Now, white population owners used cruel and ruthless methods to keep slaves powerless. Their fear? That the enslaved Africans would organize an uprising. Their first-hand accounts bear this out. How can we tell if their stories are slanted or biased in any way, though? Let's take a look at that. Let's first define what bias is. Bias is prejudice for or against something. There are many reasons an author may present a bias. For example, he or she may want readers to support the author's ideas and philosophies. Some things you need to consider before identifying a bias are: who is the author? In this case, in the piece we're about to cover, the source was written by a well-educated French colonist who defends slavery. We also ask ourselves, when was the source written? In this case, 1797. Why is that important? Well, at the time, slavery was legal in Saint-Domingue, then a colony of France. The last question is, does it present a balanced view of an issue? Let's read it to find out. Although the slaves are not the class in the population which immediately follows the whites, it seems natural to speak of them before taking up the freedmen. After all, the latter offer the combined product of the slavery of the one and of the liberty of the other, a civilization that perished, the last years of white colonial rule in Haiti, written in 1797. Well, what does this piece say about the author's opinion of Haiti's independence? Do we think we can trust what this author has to say about enslaved persons? Even if we don't know anything about the author, we can still detect bias. Notice slaves that are not in the class of the population that follows the whites. There is another class of people called the freedmen. Well, they are no longer enslaved, and they have more rights than enslaved people, but whose class is still allowed fewer rights in society than the whites. So we're looking at a variety of classes here, and this chapter opening gives us a clue that the author is biased, believing in this class structure. This is not a reliable source about the rights of enslaved persons who lived in Haiti because the author is biased. The author is a slave owner and defends the institution of slavery. It is a reliable source if we are interested in finding out why people in Haiti thought slavery was justified, even though we know that it is not, and what the attitudes of people were towards enslaved Africans. Can you detect bias in text? Now give it a try on your own. In 1791, an African priest raised a call for revolution. Within days, over 100,000 enslaved persons revolted against the plantation owners in Haiti. The rebels eventually gained control of the entire island and freed all of those enslaved. They were led by a man named Toussaint L'Ouverture. Toussaint L'Ouverture led Haiti's independence movement. He was a skilled general and diplomat, and he issued a constitution that abolished or got rid of slavery in Saint-Domingue. He died in a French prison before independence was won in 1804. Toussaint was educated and influenced by Enlightenment ideas before taking a role in the revolution. His constitution not only abolished slavery, it placed him at the head of the government. This alarmed Napoleon, who sent troops in to defeat the Haitians. L'Ouverture agreed to rejoin the French Republic if the French would abolish slavery. They agreed, but then decided to imprison him anyway, took him to France, where he was held in a tiny cell and died 10 months later. It is said that Napoleon ordered him to be put into a prison in the mountains and murdered by means of neglect, little food, no medicine when he became ill, and etc. This image shows Toussaint proclaiming Saint-Domingue's constitution on July 1st, 1801. New leaders continued the fight, and Haiti became the first colony in Latin America or the Caribbean to gain its independence. You now know that Haiti's independence movement began with the rebellion of its enslaved population, and that a freedman named Toussaint L'Ouverture led their forces to defeat the French. They were the first colony in Latin America to gain their independence. In this next segment, we'll look at the independence movements of South America. In most Latin colonial societies, classes were sharply divided. Spain instituted a strict class structure based on birth. The terms here in this diagram were used during the Spanish colonial era and are used in the context of this lesson as academic terms. Today, some of these terms, such as mulattoes and mestizos, are considered offensive when used incorrectly and should not be used in reference to any individual's race or ethnic background. So let's start from the top. Peninsulares, or peninsulares, are born in Spain and could hold high offices in Spanish colonial government. Underneath them were the criollos, or the criollos, Spaniards born in Latin America. Beneath that class was a class called mestizos, who were mixed European and Indian ancestry. And of course, beneath them, the mulattoes, who were mixed European and African ancestry, leaving the enslaved Africans and American Indians as the most oppressed groups in this entire structure. Criollos ran the day-to-day operations of the colony. They held positions in government and served as officers in the army. This group is the one that eventually leads the movement for independence throughout Latin America and inevitably comes to lead the new independent nations afterward. They were the least oppressed and best educated, sent to Europe, where they adopted Enlightenment ideas and returned eager to revolt. Unlike Haiti, where the revolution began with enslaved Africans, it was the criollos who led the fight for independence in Spanish South America. Let's take a look at why the criollos led the revolution in South America. Napoleon's wars in Europe opened an opportunity for independence in South America. In the early 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte ruled France and sought to extend his empire across much of Europe, as much Europe as possible. His wars disrupted Europe's tight colonial control of Latin America. When Napoleon seized the Spanish throne, colonial control weakened, and the Creoles, or the criollos, did not recognize the French king. They believed that the people should control the country, not the French king. As a result, the colonies rebelled. South Americans would go to war to fight for their independence. Let's take a look at some of the important leaders and their accomplishments. One brilliant general that helped lead South American independence was Simón Bolivar. He was known as the Liberator, and he was influenced by none other than Thomas Jefferson. He helped liberate northern South America from Spanish rule and wanted to create a unified Latin American republic similar to the United States. Simón Bolivar was a Criollo and general who freed much of South America from Spanish rule. He admired the French and American revolutions and hoped to win independence for his own country. While his republic, Gran Colombia, written like that, spanned a decade, its leaders could not agree on what type of government to create. Simón Bolivar liberated the North, and so now let's take a look at José de San Martin, who liberated the South. José de San Martin was a Criollo as well, who served in the Napoleonic Wars. He led Argentine rebels against the Spanish colonial government. He also led an army over the Andes Mountains to free Chile and gave control of the army to Bolivar. José de San Martin's experienced military background helped him become a powerful leader. Together, he and Bolivar ended Spanish control of South America. After his meeting with Bolivar in 1822, San Martin retired and emigrated to Europe, where he spent the rest of his life. Brazil had a unique road toward independence. In 1807, Napoleon's attack on Portugal forced the royal family to flee to Brazil. In 1822, the Criollos demanded Brazil's independence from Portugal. French troops, led by Napoleon, approached Portugal out of fear of being held captive. King John VI and the royal family left Portugal and found refuge in Brazil. They asked the prince, Dom Pedro, to rule. For 14 years, Brazil was the home of the Portuguese Empire. When Napoleon was defeated, King John headed back to Portugal, but the people of Brazil did not want to be ruled from Europe any longer. Dom Pedro officially declared Brazil independent. In 1822, Creoles demanded independence from Portugal. Thousands signed a petition for Dom Pedro, King John's son, to rule Brazil. That's when he declared Brazil independent. Brazil's strategy towards independence was less revolutionary than its Latin American counterparts. In 1822, Brazil won its independence from Portugal in a bloodless revolution. Let's take a look at the impact of independence on society. You now know that the Creoles in South America led their independence movements. Simón Bolivar raised an army to defeat Spanish forces, and the people of Brazil asked for and received an independent monarchy with the Portuguese king at its head. In this next segment, we'll look at how a Catholic priest led Mexico's path to independence. The population of colonial Mexico was very much like that of Spanish South America. Peninsulares ran the government. Remember, they were at the top of that pyramid we saw. Criollos held positions of wealth and influence, just as they had in South America. And mestizos and American Indians held the lowest positions in society. Recall that on the diagram as well. In Mexico, racial and ethnic groups mixed together more freely than in South America. And it was the mestizos and American Indians who sparked the independence movement there. Their revolutions began in a small Mexican village. On September 16, 1810, in the small village of Dolores, a priest named Padre Miguel Hidalgo, pictured here, issued a call for rebellion against Spain. Today, the call, that gathering of the lower class, is known as the Cry of Dolores. Indians and mestizos marched against the Creole and Peninsular elites. and Hidalgo and his rebels were defeated in 1811. Hidalgo was eventually tried and executed. Like scholars before him, Padre Miguel Hidalgo believed in Enlightenment ideas. The Spanish were shocked at his ability to raise an army of almost 100,000 men, but they were not well trained and were eventually defeated. Let's take a look at how Mexico eventually gained independence. Eventually, events in Spain pushed Mexico's peninsulares and criollos toward independence. Like Brazil, Mexico initially set up a monarchy, which wasn't a surprise, as this was the type of government that Spanish colonists were used to. When a coup d'etat, or a violent overthrow, in Spain overthrew the government, Agustín de Iturbide proclaimed Mexico's independence. He is pictured right here. He named himself emperor before himself being overthrown. Iturbide was overthrown just a year later by the members of the Representative Assembly. One member who opposed him was Santa Anna, who would come into office as an elected president and then later establish a dictatorship. Let's take a minute and review what you've learned about Mexican independence. Division in Latin America became the price that was paid for independence. Dozens of new countries were created instead of the unified state that Bolivar had hoped for. Latin America was divided into Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, and Central America was split into the republics of El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and Honduras. The new governments of Latin and Central America had significant challenges, though, that would greatly hinder their success. Those challenges included widespread poverty, sharp cultural differences, unequal distribution of land, lack of access to education, and a disruption of trade and commerce. Without a doubt, independence came at a rather large price. Hopes of a unified South America were dispelled as new divided countries began to develop. To make matters worse, people could not agree on what types of government to create. By 1825, all of Spanish America had won political independence. All created representative governments, but disagreements about what type of government to form led to political instability. On the left, we had the liberals, who believed in a weaker executive branch or a weaker president, with strong representative assemblies and stronger regional governments. Think Hidalgo, someone who believed in stronger regional government rather than a stronger head or president. On the right, we have the conservatives, or the strong centralized governments who believed in more authoritarian figures leading those governments. This is a more conservative platform. Classical Republicans who believed that the state should come before the rights of the individuals, and who believed that strong autocratic rule was necessary to get Latin American republics back on their feet. Think Simón Bolivar in Gran Colombia and Iturbide in Mexico. The result was political instability throughout the 1800s, with rapid turnovers of rulers and constitutions. Because there were so many problems and government could not fix them quickly enough, turnover was common as nations switched from one government or one type of government to another, and abandoned constitutions in favor of new ones, changing from representative governments to military dictatorships in the blink of an eye. Finally, let's review the time period you've been learning about in this lesson. Recall the Napoleonic Wars beginning in 1803 in Europe and how they prompted the Spanish criollos to declare independence as well. A year later, Haiti declares independence in 1804. Simón Bolivar led the revolution in Venezuela a few years later. And a few years after that, Mexico declares independence. A year after that, Brazil declares independence in 1822. By 1830, Spain had just one colony left, Cuba. Let's see what else was happening in this time period. Well, in 1776, the U.S. declared its own independence, and in 1791, the French Revolution had already begun.